My name is Emma, and my life has been full of ups and downs. I lost my parents early, which left a deep wound in my soul. But I was lucky. An elderly couple next door, the Johnsons, took me under their wing. They treated me like their own granddaughter, not as an object of charity. We weren't rich in money, but we were rich in love, and that was the main thing. When I turned 18 and started thinking about college, the Johnsons died in a car accident. I was alone again. They left me some money for school and their old house in the suburbs. It was a cozy place, full of memories, but too many ghosts of the past. So I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city near the college where I enrolled to study financial management. It was great to have a plan and move forward. The studies were challenging but interesting, and I threw myself into learning about numbers and markets. After college, I got a decent job. The days were filled with work, and overall everything was fine. But the evenings? That was a different story. The city seemed lonelier than such a crowded metropolis should be. That's when I met Mike at a friend's party. He was loud, fun, and not afraid to show it. His energy was contagious, and we hit it off right away when he accidentally bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it!" I exclaimed, more from surprise than anger. "Oh, sorry. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Mike grinned widely, not embarrassed at all. "Just beer," I replied, trying not to smile back too easily. "2 beers, coming right up," he shouted, heading towards the makeshift bar. That was Mike. Simple, straightforward, no fuss. We talked all night about everything under the sun. It turned out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. He was easy to talk to, and by the end of the party, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed. No dramatic gestures, just the two of us and a ring he clumsily pulled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me," he said, gripping the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us, so perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof," I replied, still laughing. The wedding didn't change much at first. We remained the same, just legally bound now, which felt right. We settled into my small city apartment, still close to the hustle and bustle. But now, I had someone to share the quiet moments with. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings no longer felt so empty. Married life brought comfort, but fate doesn't let you enjoy peace for too long without throwing in a few surprises. Mike's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Foster, were wonderful people. They lived in a cozy country house and welcomed me with open arms from the start. I could see where Mike got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm for my wounded heart, still missing my own family. "We're so glad you're part of our family now," Mrs. Foster would often say, squeezing my hand with a kindness that was both uplifting and a bit overwhelming. "Thank you. I really appreciate how warmly you've welcomed me," I would reply, feeling genuinely grateful. Visits to them became our weekly ritual. These days were filled with backyard barbecues and long conversations over cups of hot coffee. Life was good, simple, and honest, until everything changed. Mike was sent on a long business trip, a whole year away from home. It was a fantastic opportunity for his career, but the timing was terrible. No sooner had Mike left than Mr. and Mrs. Foster's health took a sharp decline. It all happened so fast, and Mrs. Foster, bless her heart, seemed almost crazed with worry when she called me. "Emma, I hate to ask this, but I really need your help. Mr. Foster is very ill." Her voice trembled with unshed tears. Without a second thought, I packed a bag and headed to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. and Mrs. Foster so fragile was a shock. He had always been a pillar, strong and reliable. Now he looked shrunken, tethered to life by a maze of medical tubes. I easily fell into the rhythm of their household, taking over the cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Foster focused on caring for her husband. In the evenings, I would sit by Mr. Foster's bedside, reading aloud his favorite classics. His eyes would often close long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Emma," he would whisper on good days, his voice just a shadow of his former robust tone. "It's my pleasure. Really," I would reply, squeezing his hand, trying to convey comfort through a simple touch. One afternoon, Mrs. Foster sat down at the kitchen table while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked older than her years. "Emma, I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began nervously, wringing her hands. "Mr. Foster was the main breadwinner, you see, and now with him in this condition." I put down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're struggling, dear. I hate to even ask this, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough time." She lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mrs. Foster. I'll get right on it," I said firmly, trying to ease her burden. The apartment quickly found a tenant, and each month I dutifully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Foster, along with money for groceries and the mounting bills. It wasn't easy. The commute to my job in the city became a nightmare, but family sticks together, right? That's what I kept telling myself even on the hardest days. "You're a godsend, Emma," Mrs. Foster would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd respond, though some nights, as I lay in the guest room listening to the distant sounds of sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. Mike's calls were my only respite, his voice a tether to another life. "How's it going, Emma? Are you holding up okay?" His concern was always evident even through the static of long-distance calls. "We're managing. Don't worry about us." I'd force cheerfulness into my voice, not wanting to add to his stress. Life in the Foster household took a drastic turn when Laura, Mrs. Foster's daughter from her first marriage, showed up unexpectedly. The atmosphere shifted immediately. She had that kind of presence, like a cold draft sneaking under the door. I had never really known Laura well, but I'd heard enough from Mike and even glimpsed her frosty relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Foster during brief, tense visits. My days were already stretched thin, juggling long commutes to work and caring for Mr. Foster, who was now bedridden and fading fast. However, Laura's arrival added a whole new level of tension. It was clear she was here to stay, making herself at home as if she owned the place. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Mr. Foster beckoned me to his side with a weak gesture. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Emma, you need to be careful of Laura. She's a very bad person." The gravity in his tone pulled a knot tight in my stomach. "I understand, Mr. Foster. I'll be careful," I promised, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was promising against. True to Mr. Foster's warning, Laura wasted no time establishing her new regime. The first sign was when I found her in the kitchen one morning, her presence like a storm cloud over the breakfast nook. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play maid or chef for anyone," she declared, her tone sharp as she sipped her coffee, eyeing me like I was an intruder in her mother's kitchen. I was taken aback, but managed to keep my cool. "Okay, Laura, I've been handling things so far, and I can keep at it," I said, trying to keep the peace. "Good. Because I don't plan on lifting a finger. This is Mom's house after all, she snapped back, her eyes daring me to challenge her. From that day on, Laura made sure her presence was felt, and not in a good way. She'd order takeout just for herself and her mother, leaving their empty boxes on the table for me to clean up. Her disdain wasn't subtle, and it stung, but I swallowed the bitterness because Mr. and Mrs. Foster needed peace. "Emma, why don't you sit and eat with us tonight?" Mrs. Foster asked one evening, a rare moment of old warmth in her voice. Before I could respond, Laura cut in sharply. "Mom, Emma's been busy all day. She probably prefers eating later." Her words were coated with fake concern, but the message was clear. I wasn't welcome. The days grew heavier, my chores doubling. Laura's self-importance filled every corner of the house. I'd hear her whispering with her mother at night, turning her against me with poisonous words. Mrs. Foster, once so kind and understanding, started to change too. Her looks grew colder, her thank yous fewer. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Foster passed away. The funeral was a solemn affair, with Mike flying in just in time to say his goodbyes. It was the first time in months we were together, and the relief of having him by my side was palpable. Yet amidst the mourning, I noticed the air had shifted significantly at the Foster residence. Laura was on her best behavior, treating everyone with forced politeness. "How's everything been while I've been gone?" Mike asked me quietly during a brief moment we had alone after the service. "Fine, everything's been fine," I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to burden him further. His grief was enough to handle. "You sure? You look a bit worn out," he pressed, his brow furrowed with concern. "It's just been busy, helping out around here," I reassured him, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't the time to delve into the mess that was brewing beneath the surface. As soon as Mike left, Laura dropped her act. The mask of the dutiful sister was gone, replaced by the sneering, dismissive attitude I'd grown accustomed to. The dynamic in the house shifted drastically. Mrs. Foster, perhaps in her own throbbing grief, became distant and cold towards me. Commands replaced conversations, and I felt more like an intruder than a family member. Laura took over the household like she was the lady of the manor. Her reign was marked by disregard for anyone's feelings but her own. She started barging into my room without knocking, rummaging through my things as though searching for buried treasure. One afternoon, I was out in the garden trying to find some peace when I stumbled upon a box lying among the shrubs. Curiosity piqued, I opened it only to find my watches, jewelry, and even some underwear. My heart sank. Nearby, draped carelessly over a bush, were several of my dresses. Fury bubbled up inside me as I gathered my belongings. Clutching the box, I stormed inside, finding Laura in the living room, lounging like she owned the place. "What the hell, Laura?" I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. "You can't just throw my stuff out!" Laura laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed mockingly around the room. "Live here? Please, you're just a guest, and not a welcome one. You should be out in the garden, or better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a shameless beggar anyway." Her words stung like salt in a wound. I couldn't believe the venom in her voice. Trembling, I turned to Mrs. Foster, who had just entered the room. "Mrs. Foster, please tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too," I pleaded, my voice cracking. Mrs. Foster, once kind and gentle, now looked through me as if I were glass. "This is Laura's house now. She's right, Emma. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live." Her words were a blow I hadn't anticipated. I stood there, the box in my hands, my heart breaking in my chest. The home I had come to know, the family I thought I had, crumbled around me in that instant. Despite all this, I stayed because of a promise I had made to Mr. Foster on his deathbed, to look after his wife and not let Laura overpower her. But day by day, Mrs. Foster seemed to be adopting Laura's cruel traits. Her words became sharp, her eyes cold. "You're just sitting around doing nothing, aren't you?" Mrs. Foster snapped one evening as I was cleaning up after dinner, her voice dripping with contempt. "I'm doing my best to keep things in order," I replied, trying to keep my voice even despite the pain her words caused. "Your best? Could have fooled me. Seems like you're just living off the fat of the land," she scoffed, turning her back on me and walking out of the room. Her words stung. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my apartment and was transferring almost all of that income to Mrs. Foster, on top of doing most of the housework while Laura did nothing but criticize. Laura, living off her mother's pension, was relentless. "What did my brother ever see in you?" She would taunt me every evening, her voice loud enough to penetrate through the thin walls. I bit my tongue, swallowed my anger and disappointment, and reminded myself of the promise I had made. But the atmosphere was suffocating, the house a minefield of hostility. One evening, coming home early from work, my world turned upside down. I walked in and overheard Laura and Mrs. Foster having a heated discussion in the living room, unaware of my arrival. "We need to make her sell that apartment. You know how much we need the money," Laura was saying, her tone greedy and calculating. "Yes, but how do we convince her? Emma's not stupid. She won't just give it up," Mrs. Foster replied, her voice a mix of frustration and greed. "Leave it to me, Mom. I'll persuade her. Once she signs, we can finally live the way we deserve." Laura's words slithered through the air like a snake. Hearing them plot to strip me of my only financial security was a cold splash of reality. Fear gripped me. I couldn't stay any longer. My heart was pounding as I slipped quietly into my room. They were planning to take everything from me. The decision was made right there. I couldn't stay anymore. Hastily packing the essentials, my hands were shaking. Every second in this house now felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't say goodbye. They didn't deserve it. Quietly slipping out the back door, I called a taxi to the train station. Sitting on the train heading to Mike's state, doubts swarmed in my head. Would he understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty was crushing, but the fear of what might happen if I stayed was stronger. I looked out the window, watching the landscape blur, feeling a mix of fear and determination in my chest. When I arrived at Mike's, his reaction was a mix of shock, relief, and a whirlwind of questions. His eyes widened as he opened the door and saw me standing there with a bag in hand, probably looking as exhausted as I felt. "Emma, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated, taking in the familiar, cozy sight of his temporary home. "No, Mike. Everything is far from okay," I replied, my voice cracking. He led me to the couch, his face now etched with concern. "Tell me what happened," he urged. I told him everything, from Laura's return, the deteriorating conditions in the house, the financial manipulations, to the final straw, the plot to make me sell my apartment. I hadn't wanted to worry him earlier, didn't want to add stress while he was away for work. Mike's face darkened with each word I spoke. By the time I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and concern. "I didn't want to cause more problems. I thought I could handle it," I admitted, feeling foolish now. "Emma, damn it, you shouldn't have had to handle this alone," he exploded, standing up to pace the room. "I can't believe my mom and Laura treated you like this." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes blazing. "I won't let anyone treat my wife like this. No way." He pulled out his phone, and I watched, my heart pounding, as he dialed his mother's number. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her words, but the tension in Mike's shoulders spoke volumes. "Mom, this has to stop. I know everything, and I won't tolerate it. If Laura doesn't leave, and if you don't start treating Emma with respect, you can forget about our help. No more money, nothing." Mike's voice was steel, leaving no room for argument. There was a brief, furious exchange, then silence. Mike's hand tightened around the phone. "Fine. If that's your choice, you've made mine too," he said finally, and hung up. He turned to me, his expression softening. "Looks like it's just us now, baby. That's all we need," he said, coming over to embrace me. I leaned into him, the safety of his arms fortifying me against the whirlwind of emotions. "Just us," I murmured, feeling the truth of his words. We were alone now, but somehow it felt right. Mike and I talked late into the night. We discussed practical things, like my arrangements for remote work and our financial plans without the added burden of supporting his mother and Laura. It felt like we were laying the foundations for a new chapter. "Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right?" Mike said with a determined smile. "Right," I smiled back, feeling more confident with him by my side. The next few days flew by in a whirlwind of activity. I contacted my work to arrange for remote work, which they fortunately agreed to. Mike helped me move my things from storage and set up a home office in the corner of his living room. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and there was peace here. A week into our newfound world of peace, I was jolted by a call that almost felt like a ghost from a past life. It was Mrs. Foster, her voice once sweet to me, now dripping with a mix of desperation and entitlement. "Emma, why haven't I received the money for this month? You know we depend on it," she demanded immediately. I was stunned for a moment. Her audacity was incredible. "I'm sorry, but after everything that happened, do you really expect me to keep supporting you?" I asked, my tone more incredulous than angry. In the background, I could hear Laura's shrill, angry voice. "She's just an ungrateful girl, Mom. Make her transfer the money." Taking a deep breath to calm my rising anger, I remembered the poisonous words they had thrown at me, words that had cut deep. "Mrs. Foster, Laura called me a shameless beggar, remember? I won't be sending money to people who treat me like trash. I'm done." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost picture Mrs. Foster's shocked face. "But we're family," she finally said, her voice a mix of anger and pleading. "No, family doesn't treat each other like this. Goodbye, Mrs. Foster," I said firmly, and hung up before she could respond. The call shook me, but Mike was there, his support unwavering. "You did the right thing, Emma. It's time they learned to stand on their own feet," he reassured me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. Soon after we returned to our hometown, we had another surprise. I was pregnant. The news brought a joy we hadn't expected, and suddenly the future seemed full of possibilities. We decided it was time to sell my apartment and buy a small house in the suburbs, a place near a good school where our child could grow up. As we were planning the move, another call came through, again from Mrs. Foster. This time her tone was different, almost pitiful, desperate. "Emma, I made a mistake. Laura made me sell the house, took the money, and left me with nothing. Can I come live with you and Mike?" Her voice trembled, pleading. This request caught me off guard. After everything that had happened, it was a test of my resolve. "Mrs. Foster, you chose this path when you sided with Laura against us. You could have chosen differently," I said, my voice firm despite my inner turmoil. I know. I made mistakes. But you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices?" she begged. I sighed, feeling a pang of pity, but remembering the pain her choices had caused. "I forgave you long ago, but that doesn't mean I can let you back into my life. You need to live with the consequences of your actions, as I had to," I replied and ended the call. Then, with a decisive press, I blocked her number. We continued with our plans, buying a cozy house with a small garden where our child could play. It was a lazy Sunday morning, lingering over coffee and the newspaper. I was flipping through the pages when a headline caught my eye. "Local woman arrested in major fraud scheme." There, staring back at me from the page, was Laura in handcuffs, looking defeated. I couldn't help but feel a mix of shock and, I admit, a small satisfaction wash over me. "Look at this, Mike," I called, lifting the paper for him to see. "It's Laura. She's been arrested for fraud." Mike took the paper, scanning the article with a serious expression. "Wow. Can't say I'm surprised, but still, it explains a lot." "Yes, it does. But she made her choices, and now she's facing the consequences," I replied, feeling a closure I hadn't realized I needed. News eventually reached us through friends that Mrs. Foster was living in a tiny apartment, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Her pension wasn't enough to cover living expenses and pay off the debt Laura had left behind. "Have you heard about your mom?" One of Mike's friends, Matt, brought up one evening when they were over for a backyard barbecue. "Yeah, I've heard," Mike replied, flipping burgers on the grill. His voice held a trace of sadness, but was tempered with resolution. "She made her choices, Matt. It's tough, but it is what it is." Matt nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. "You're right, buddy. Just thought you should know." The conversation shifted after that, the evening air filled with lighter topics of sports and work. Life was moving on, and so were we. The joy of our new life truly crystallized when Mia came into the world. Becoming parents changed everything. Our priorities, our dreams, and even healed some old wounds, filling them with new love. "Can you believe she's ours?" I whispered to Mike one night as we watched Mia sleep peacefully in her crib. "She's perfect, Emma. Just perfect," Mike murmured back, his voice thick with emotion. We spent our days marveling at each of Mia's little achievements. Every smile, every giggle. She was our little miracle, and with her, the hardships of the past seemed to recede, making room for new memories, better ones. Each day was simple but filled with little moments of joy that stitched together the tapestry of a happy family life. Looking at Mike playing with Mia on our living room floor, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. We had been through a lot, but here, in this moment, I knew we had found our true home, in each other and in our little family.